Hello everyone, and welcome to week 4 of American Literature. This week you'll be watching this week's lecture first, then I'd like you to actively read this week's text. We're going to start by reading the introduction to this new section, American Literature 1700 to 1820, and that's found on pages 365 to 378. Next, I'd like you to read Jonathan Edwards, the biography on him, from 396 to 398, and then to focus on one of his sermons, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, found on pages 430 to 441. And then finally, you'll be reading the Native Americans Contact and Conflict section from 442 to 455. The discussion is not just on shift and thought leaders, it's actually going to be on the Native Americans Contact and Conflict. So, as you'll see in reading the introduction, the 18th century saw enormous changes in economically, socially, philosophically, and scientifically that inevitably affected the influence. That inevitably affected the influence and authority of the clergymen. So as you saw in the first couple weeks of this class, the church was at the center of authority in the new America, and that was completely shifted in the time that we're moving into, and it transformed the ways in which people of this time understood the world. Most importantly, many intellectuals now believed in the power of the human mind to comprehend the universe as never before. There would be a religious element to this new nation, but it would only be one component of the state, whose destiny, while still thought of as divinely guaranteed, was understood to be achievable on earth through the spread of democracy. The literature of the century reflected and extended these and other new currents in Western thought and culture. So the big things that changed: there was an increased reliance on science and a decreased faith and religion. Huge discoveries were made by John Locke and Adam Smith postulate that human sympathy, rather than the supernatural grace, is the basis for moral life. So each individual has an individual choice to make moral decisions, rather than it's just their fate as they were created by God. Also, American democracy emerges as a mixture of divine mandate and social contract. Another thing that's happening is that the 18th century brought a new world into being in the most basic and striking ways. The increase in population alone helps account for the greater diversity of opinion in religious as well as in political life that marked it and its literature. So there's huge population growth happening during this time period. In 1670 there were 111,000 people in the colonies. By 1700, 30 years later, there were 250,000. Then 60 years later, there were 1,600,000. That's a huge growth. The demand for and price of colonial goods increased in England, and vast fortunes were to be made in New England with any new business that was established. So that was connected with shipbuilding. So things like tar, timber, and pitch. Virginia planters became rich through tobacco and rice and indigo from the Carolinas were in constant demand. The rapid expansion of transatlantic trade, the hallmark of what we now recognize as the beginning of modern consumerism, linked the colonies to other areas in what historians call the Atlantic Rim. United by the common experience of ocean passage and the desire to make new lives for themselves, these thousands of emigrants slowly but inexorably began to realize that they had more in common as inhabitants of America than they did as emigrants from a Europe that rapidly receded into memory. In 1702, no one would have dreamed an independent union of colonies, but in the 1750s, by the 1750s, people had started to think about it. And a distinctly American culture has begun to emerge. some of the ideals of the Enlightenment ideals this is a quote from the chapter you're going to be reading. The inevitable result of such inquiries made the universe seem much more rational and benevolent than it had been represented in Puritan doctrine. Similarly, people increasingly define their highest duties in social rather than spiritual terms. So Enlightenment rationalism is more than just an attack on the religious beliefs that came before it. Many Enlightenment thinkers were outright atheists and would replace any sort of religious belief with a rational and scientific worldview. But the majority were involved in a complex interplay between religion and science that served as a crucial underpinning of the intellectual climate of the American Revolution. And it's something that you need to start paying attention to. You'll see there's a shift in how people interact with their preacher, as we'll see with Jonathan Edwards. The preachers are no longer the thought leaders. This begins to shift in this era. And this is what's going to lay the groundwork for what will become the American Revolution. So just take a look at this picture here. This is a painting of Charles Willson Peale, the artist in his museum, from 1822, and it's a self-portrait by the artist, and it serves as an excellent allegory for the ways in which Enlightenment thought inspired people to derive their knowledge of the world from direct observation. So you can see the specimens of animals that Peale has included in his studio to use as a reference for his paintings. So he no longer is he's not painting from the imagination, he's painting from actual scientific, these are dead animals that he's painting from, so he can be scientifically exact. And that's really an allegory for how people are starting to think. They are focused on trying to make sense of the real substance of the scientific world versus what the scripture tells you will happen later after you die. This is another one. This is an electricity experiment. It's a French engraving from the late 18th century, and you can see this is scientific experiments such as the one that's illustrated in this engraving, in which the human body is tested for electrical conductivity, may seem laughably naive now. It is the 18th century's ambition and willingness to take risks in the pursuit of truth that should still inspire us today. So this was a time of exploration, and everything was game, right, as a way to understand science. And we'll begin to see that even more as we read further in the next few weeks. Finally, here's a picture of George Whitefield preaching at the same time that Enlightenment, and this is from 1742, at the same time that Enlightenment scientists and philosophers were engaged in a project to map out the workings of the natural world through scientific means, a transatlantic religious revival was taking place in the 1730s. And beyond that, saw preachers such as Jonathan Edwards, who we're going to be reading this week, attempting to recapture the spiritual fervor of the Puritan era. So after you've completed your active reading for this week, I'd like you to do this post for this week's discussion, Native Americans, Contact, and Conflict. First, I'd like you to actively read the Native Americans, Contact, and Conflict, the entire section. Then choose one of the speeches from the section and answer the following questions about the speech you choose. Please make sure you post about a speech that has not yet been posted. I realize we'll reach a point where they've all been posted, but I need all of them to be represented in some way. So introduce the speaker to the class. That's your first point. Use visuals when possible. You'll have to do a little research to find these visuals. Who was he? When did he live? What tribe is he from? And please don't just use the book. Try to do some extra research to understand this. Second, explain the conditions that led to the speech, when and where it took place, and for what purpose the speaker is speaking. Finally, how is the speech constructed? What is being said and how? Are there any repetitions? Is it passionate? Is it not passionate? Is it logical? Does it remind you of something else? And then finally, what outcome, if any, resulted from the speech? What happened after the speech was given? Did anything happen? What happened to the person who gave the speech? After you've posted your own post, please go back and respond to at least 3 of your peers' posts. I have graded your first week's post, so go back and take a look to see how I graded it. If you have any questions about how I graded, the most important thing is anything that you say in this in your discussion, please make sure you use evidence from the text to support what you're saying. Please make sure you answer all the questions that are posted and the ones that I've talked about in this discussion, in this lecture. And finally, when you respond to your peers' post, make sure you extend the conversation. This is where you can compare and contrast different speeches and really help us get deeper into what was going on during this era. All right, and feel free to link it all back to the main topic that we're talking about this week, and that is really the shift to an enlightenment in the Americas. So please have fun writing these up, have fun reading, and let me know if you have any questions. I am back on campus now. If you want to stop by and say hi, please feel free to do so. It'd be great to meet you guys. If not, I'll see you guys online.